Amelia Harris did not cry when Ethan Wilder looked at her limp and said, "You ain't what I sent for." She did not cry when he turned his back and walked away while the whole platform watched. She pressed her teeth together so hard her jaw ached, picked up her single worn trunk with both hands, and dragged it off the platform herself, one uneven step at a time, into the Arizona heat alone with $23 and no way home. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The train had been 3 days late out of Columbus, and by the time it pulled into Silver Creek, Arizona territory, Amelia Harris had eaten the last of her bread on the second morning and had nothing left but the smell of coal smoke in her hair and a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine that she kept in the front pocket of her traveling coat. 12 letters. She had read every one of them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Ethan Wilder had a good hand, steady, even strokes. He had told her about the ranch, about the wide sky, about needing a woman with good sense and a willing heart. He had never once mentioned what he expected her body to look like when she stepped off the train. Amelia had been honest in her own letters. She had told him about Ohio, about her father's farm, about the fall from the hayloft when she was 11 that had left her left leg 2 inches shorter than her right. She had told him plainly the way her mother had always told her to lead with truth and let a man decide for himself. She had told him, and he had written back warm and steady, and she had believed every word. She believed them all the way up to the moment she saw his face change. He was standing at the far end of the platform, hat in hand, and she had recognized him from the photograph he'd sent. Square jaw, light eyes, a neatly pressed shirt that looked like someone had ironed it that morning. He was smiling when she first stepped down. Then she walked toward him, and his smile did not disappear all at once. It went out the way a lamp goes out when you pinch the wick slow, then suddenly gone. "Miss Harris," he said, and even his voice had flattened. "Mr. Wilder." She stopped in front of him and put out her hand, because that was the proper thing to do, and she was not going to let him see her falter. "It's good to finally meet you in person." He shook her hand once barely and let it go fast. His eyes had already moved down to her left leg and back up again, and she watched him make the calculation. Men always made the slight furrow between his brows, the way his jaw tightened. "You didn't say it was that bad," he said. Amelia felt the words land somewhere behind her sternum. She kept her face still. "I told you about my leg in the second letter I sent, and the fourth. You said you had a slight injury. I said I had a permanent limp from a childhood fall. I wrote it out plain." Ethan's jaw moved. He looked past her at the train, then back at the platform, then at her face, and she could see him building toward something. She had seen that look before, not on him, but on other men. Men deciding. Men measuring. "I run a working ranch, Miss Harris. I need a woman who can keep pace. I kept pace across 3 states to get here, Mr. Wilder." Her voice was level, and she was proud of that. "It ain't the same." He put his hat back on slowly, and the gesture told her everything. "I got responsibilities. I got hands who need feeding before sun-up a house that don't run itself. I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I thought you'd be more like what a man out here needs." "More like what a man needs," she repeated. "I'm sorry for the trouble of the trip," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded bill. He held it out toward her like it was a receipt he was settling. "That should cover the fare back to Columbus. There's a eastbound train day after tomorrow." Amelia looked at the money. She did not move to take it. The platform was not empty. There were maybe 8 or 9 people standing within earshot. A woman in a blue dress pretending to study her handbag. A man in a leather apron who had stopped still and was watching openly a boy of about 12 who had no shame about staring at all. Every one of them had heard. Every one of them was waiting to see what she would do. She looked back at Ethan Wilder. "I crossed half this country on your word," she said, and her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear it now. "I sold my father's pocket watch to pay for new boots for this trip. I have $23 left to my name and no kin within 1,000 miles, And you're standing here handing me train fare, like I'm a mail parcel you decided you didn't want after all." Something flickered in his face. It might have been shame. It went out just as fast as it came. "That's about the size of it," he said. "I'm sorry, Miss Harris. It's just not going to work." He set the bill on top of her trunk, tipped his hat with 2 fingers, the smallest, most dismissive tip she had ever seen, and walked off the platform without looking back. Amelia stood there. She let herself stand there for exactly as long as it took to breathe in through her nose and out through her mouth 3 times. The paper bill lifted slightly in the dry desert wind, and she put her hand flat on it before it could blow away. $20. She folded it into her coat pocket. Then she picked up the handle of her trunk, one good grip with her right hand and a braced pull with her left, and she started moving. One of the platform women, the one in the blue dress, made a soft sound. Not kindness. More like a person acknowledging that something unfortunate had happened the way you acknowledge weather. Amelia did not look at her. She dragged the trunk down the platform steps one at a time, the uneven rhythm of her gait louder than usual on the dry wood, and she set her eyes on the far end of the main street, because a moving target is harder to pity than a standing one, and she had no interest in being pitied. The town of Silver Creek was not large. One main street, a feed store, a hotel with a crooked sign, a saloon that was already alive with noise. Though it was not yet noon, a dry goods store, a livery stable at the far end. She walked past all of it. She walked past a woman who looked at her trunk, and then at her limp, and then looked away. She walked past 2 men sitting on a bench outside the barber shop who watched her the way men in small towns always watched strangers, not hostile, not friendly, just cataloging. She kept her chin level and her hand on the trunk handle, and she kept moving. She got as far as the dry goods store before she had to stop because her hip was screaming. She put the trunk down against the storefront wall and pressed her back to the wood and shut her eyes for one moment, just one, and let the pain roll through her without chasing it. Her grandmother had taught her that. Don't fight pain. Let it pass through you like a river through a field. It don't stay forever, it just passes through. When she opened her eyes, there was a woman standing in the doorway of the dry goods store watching her. Older 60s maybe, with a sharp face and a white apron, and the expression of someone who had seen enough of the world to not be particularly surprised by any of it. "You're the Harris girl," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am." Word travels fast in Silver Creek. The woman studied her for a beat. "I heard what Wilder did. I'm sorry for it." "Thank you," Amelia said, "because that was what you said. You got somewhere to stay." "Not yet." The woman's mouth pressed thin. "Hotel's 15 cents a night. Mrs. Pruitt, who runs it, will want a week up front if she doesn't know you." "I know." Amelia did the arithmetic in her head, and it was not good arithmetic. "There might be work," the woman said, and her tone was careful. The way people are careful when they're offering something they think you might be too proud to take. "Washing. Some of the households here take on day help." Amelia nodded. "I'd be grateful to hear of any." The woman looked at her for another long moment, then something in her face shifted into something that was almost respect, or at least its close cousin. "Come inside," she said. "I'll give you water, and you can sit for a spell while I think on who might have need of you." The woman's name was Frances Dodd. She ran the dry goods store with her husband, who was currently away buying stock in Tucson, and she knew everything about everyone in Silver Creek in the way that storekeepers in small towns always do, because people talk while they shop, and because a good storekeeper listens without appearing to. She gave Amelia a tin cup of water and a stool behind the counter, and she talked while she counted inventory, and Amelia listened. It was Frances who first mentioned Gideon Wilder. "Ethan's brother," she said, not looking up from her count. "Older by 4 years. Runs the homestead out on the north side of the valley about 3 miles out. Ethan's got the bigger spread, the one with the good water rights, but Gideon's worked his land longer." She paused, moving bolts of cloth from one stack to another. "Except lately nobody's seen much of him. Jim Holt came in 2 weeks ago and said he'd tried to stop by to settle a fence argument, and Gideon hadn't come to the door. That ain't like him. Gideon Wilder is the kind of man who comes to the door." "Is he ill?" Amelia asked. Francis set down a bolt of brown cotton. Could be. He's had a bad chest since winter. Doc Henley said he needed rest, and he didn't rest because he never rests. Stubborn as a post. She picked up the bolt again. Nobody's checked on him properly because his nearest neighbor is 3 miles off, and people have their own trouble, I suppose. Amelia turned the tin cup in her hands. She thought about what 3 miles meant in Arizona heat, with a bad hip and a trunk she couldn't drag that far. She thought about $23.20, and about hotel rooms and washing work, and the way this whole town had watched Ethan Wilder walk away from her without anyone saying a word to stop him. "Is there a doctor in town?" she said. "Doc Henley's in Prescott till the end of the month. Does anyone plan to go check on him?" Francis was quiet for a moment. "His brother ought to." "Yes," Amelia said. "He ought to." The silence that followed had a shape to it. Francis kept counting, but her hands slowed. "You've got some nursing in you," she said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "My grandmother was a healer," Amelia said. "I helped her from the time I was 7. I know enough." Francis put down the bolt of cloth and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd come inside. "You know what you're walking into if you go out there," she said. "Gideon Wilder's a hard man. Not cruel, I don't mean that. But he don't let people in easy, and he don't ask for help, and he won't be glad to see a stranger at his door." "I haven't been glad to see most of the people I've met today either," Amelia said. "That doesn't seem like a good enough reason to leave a man to die alone." Francis held her gaze for a long beat. Then she turned and went to the back of the store and came back with a cloth sack. She didn't make ceremony of it, didn't offer an explanation. She just set it on the counter in front of Amelia. And Amelia looked inside and saw dried willow bark, a tin of camphor, a clean cloth, a small jar of honey, and half a round of hard cheese. "The willow's for fever," Francis said. "You likely know that already." "I do," Amelia said. "North Road out of town past the dry creek bed left at the Split Rock. You'll see the gate." Amelia stood up from the stool. Her hip objected, and she ignored it the way you ignore things that don't have the decency to be less painful just because you need them to be. She picked up the cloth sack. She left her trunk with Francis. The woman hadn't offered, and Amelia hadn't asked. They'd just arrived at it mutually. And she walked out into the afternoon heat with a sack of remedies and 43 cents more worth of belonging in Silver Creek than she'd had 2 hours ago. The road was hard-packed and pale, and the sun was direct and uninterested in her circumstances. She walked. The desert around her was not the emptiness she had expected from Ohio. It was full of things: creosote and scrub oak and flat-tailed lizards, and the thin, distant shapes of mountains that looked painted on. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful, when they have no intention of being beautiful for you, specifically just existing in their own terms, indifferent and immense. She walked and did not count the miles. She walked until she came to the Split Rock, which was exactly as Francis had described: a boulder broken clean down the middle, like something had decided to be honest about what it was. She turned left. She walked another half-mile on ground that was more rock than road. She was sweating through her traveling coat, and her left hip had moved past screaming into a kind of dull, grinding insistence that she had learned to negotiate with rather than fight. She saw the fence line first, then the gate iron and wood hanging open on one hinge. She pushed through it. The yard was quiet, in a way that was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind that gathers in a place where a person has stopped being present enough to fill it up. She crossed the yard, hard earth, a water trough that needed filling, a gray horse in a small corral who lifted his head and watched her with large dark eyes, and she went to the door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. "Mr. Wilder? My name is Amelia Harris. Francis Dodd sent me out to check on you. I'm coming in." She opened the door. The heat inside was immediate and wrong. Not the dry outside heat, a close, wet heat, the kind that gathers around fever. It was dim, and it smelled of sweat, and something sharper, medicinal, gone stale. The man was on the cot along the far wall. She registered him the way she'd been trained to register a patient, not as a stranger, not as a situation, but as a body that needed assessment. She moved to him fast and practiced and put the back of her hand to his forehead without ceremony. The fever was bad. High enough that the skin nearly burned her. His breathing was rough, each inhale catching on something in his chest, and she could hear the rattle without leaning close. He was a large man, she registered that too, because it was relevant broad through the chest and shoulders, dark-haired with a thick beard that had grown past what was kept and into what was neglected. His color was wrong. His lips were dry and cracked, and he'd been without water long enough to matter. His eyes opened. They were gray, she noticed. Very gray, very direct, even through the haze of fever. They fixed on her face with the stubborn focus of a man who has not given up on being conscious even when his body is trying to make that argument for him. "Who are you?" His voice came out like gravel over dry wood. Low, rough, barely there. "My name is Amelia Harris," she said, and she was already opening the cloth sack, already looking for the tin of camphor, already running the calculation of willow bark, steep time, against how long he'd been running this fever. "I'm going to take care of you. Don't fight me on it." A long pause. Then, very quietly, something that might have been a half-breath of a sound, not a laugh exactly, more like the ghost of one. "You always come at a man that way," he said. "Only when the man needs it," she said, and did not stop moving. His name, she would learn in the next hour, was Gideon Wilder. He was 41 years old, had run this land for 14 years, had never once in that time asked a soul for help with anything, and was currently running a fever high enough to kill him if it didn't break in the next day or two. He had a chest infection that had been left too long, a cut on his right forearm that was infected and had turned the skin around it an ugly red-purple that she did not like one bit, and he had not had water since the morning before, because he hadn't had the strength to get up and get it himself. She got water first. She got it from the well outside 2 trips, and she got him to drink even though he resisted, and he only stopped resisting when she said, "If you die of thirst while I'm standing here with a cup that is not going to reflect well on either one of us." And something in that got through to him, and he drank. Then she set the willow bark to steep on the stove she coaxed to life with kindling she found in a box near the wall. Then she cleaned the cut on his arm with water and the camphor and a clean cloth torn from her traveling coat, the one she'd been wearing all day across the desert through the worst morning of her adult life, and he flinched once and set his jaw and did not make another sound, which she noted. "That cut's been bad for a while," she said, working on it. "Week, maybe?" His voice was still rough but slightly clearer now that he'd had water. "Barbed wire. It needed cleaning when it happened." "I know. Why didn't you clean it?" A pause. "Was busy." Amelia looked up from the cut just long enough to look at his face. His eyes were still on her, still that same direct gray, and he looked like a man who knew exactly how bad an answer "was busy" was, and had given it anyway because it was the true one. "You were busy," she said. "Ranch don't run itself." "No," she said. "I've been told that recently." She went back to the cut. "But a dead man doesn't run it either, so." Another one of those almost sounds that almost wasn't a laugh. She had the willow bark steeped and cooled enough to drink within the half hour, and she had him sit up enough to take it, which was an argument, and then was not an argument because she informed him plainly that she could pour it down his throat if he preferred. And he looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes, and apparently concluded she meant it. So he sat up and took the cup himself. "What's in this?" he said. "Willow bark. It'll bring the fever down." He drank it, made a face. "Tastes like saddle leather." "It's medicine, not dessert." She held the cup until he finished it. "I'm going to need to check your chest. Breathe in and tell me where it hurts." He breathed in. His jaw tightened. "Left side." "Deep as you can." He tried. The rattle was bad on both sides, but worse on the left. She pressed carefully along his ribs, and he did not flinch until she hit a point midway up on the left, and then he caught his breath sharp and held it. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "You're doing it right." She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and she was doing what her grandmother had taught her to do, assessing not just the body, but the person inside it. Gideon Wilder was sick enough to have died in the next few days if no one had come. He knew it. He hadn't sent for anyone. He had been here alone in this close, hot room, and he had not asked a living soul for help. "How long have you been lying here?" she asked. He considered this with what seemed like genuine effort. 3 days maybe, could be 4. Alone? Yes. You have hands on this ranch? 2. They're out at the summer pasture. He paused. I sent them out myself, before I got bad. You knew you were getting sick and you sent your help away. He didn't answer. He looked at the ceiling. His profile was strong even through the fever. A clean line of jaw under the beard, a broad forehead, a face that was not easy but was not unkind. He had the look of a man who had spent many years deciding things on his own, and had perhaps decided 1 or 2 of them wrong. "Mr. Wilder," she said. "Gideon." "Gideon." She folded the cloth in her hands. "I'm going to stay through the night and likely several days after. Your fever needs to come down steady, and that arm needs watching, or it'll go worse. I don't have anywhere particular to be." She paused, and the honesty of that was a small, sharp thing she let pass through her without stopping on it. "If you want me to go, I'll go, and you can argue with the fever yourself, but I'd rather stay and do what I can." He turned his head and looked at her. The gray eyes were clearer than they'd been when she arrived. The water and the willow bark were already working, and there was something in them she hadn't expected. Not gratitude yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man seeing a thing clearly for the first time. "You're the woman Ethan sent for," he said. It was not a question. She went still for only a half second before she answered. "I was," she said. "Not anymore." Gideon held her eyes. Something moved through his face that was complicated and heavy, and not small. "He turned you away," he said. It came out flat and without question, the way a man says a thing he already knows the answer to. "He did," she said. She kept her voice even and her hands still. Gideon looked at the ceiling again. When he spoke, his voice had gone darker, a low current beneath the roughness of the sickness in it. "I'm sorry for what he did," he said. "That ain't how a man ought to treat a woman who came all this way." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. She had not expected that. She had expected the way men in small towns protect each other from the weight of what they do, the polite blindness, the "it's none of my business," the "well, you know how these things go." She had not expected the flat directness of what he'd said or the steadiness of it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He closed his eyes. The fever was pulling at him, and she could see the effort it was taking him to stay present. His breathing was still rough but steadier than it had been when she'd arrived. "You know what you're doing," he said low. "With the medicine." "I do." "Where'd you learn it?" "My grandmother," she said. She spent her whole life knowing things the doctors charged money for. She said healing wasn't something one person owned. It just passed from hand to hand. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, without opening his eyes, "Your grandmother sounds like a sensible woman." "The most sensible person I ever knew," Amelia said. She sat with him, while the afternoon turned toward evening, and the room cooled by degrees, and the willow bark tea worked its slow, deliberate work on the fever. She didn't talk much, and he didn't either. They were both people who had spent enough time alone to know that silence between two people can be a kind of company, if both of them let it. She checked the cut on his arm again at sundown. The red-purple edge had not spread, which was the first good news of the day. "It's holding," she told him. "Good," he said. She made him drink another cup of the willow tea, and he made the same face, and didn't say anything about it tasting like saddle leather this time. She took that as progress. Outside the window, the Arizona sky was going to color. She could see the edge of it through the glass, the high amber, and the deep red, coming in over the mountains. She had been awake since before Columbus had eaten. Almost nothing had been rejected in front of strangers, and had walked 3 miles in the heat, and had sat beside a sick man's bed for 4 hours. She was not afraid. That surprised her in a quiet way. She had expected to be afraid after everything that had happened today. She had expected the kind of fear that follows humiliation, the shrinking, the second-guessing, the voice that says maybe he was right about you. But what she felt instead was something simpler and more solid than fear. She had a thing to do. She knew how to do it, and she was going to do it. That was enough. In the cot against the wall, Gideon Wilder breathed in rough and out steady, and the evening came in through the window, and Amelia Harris sat in a chair that was not hers, in a house that was not hers, in a town that had watched her be abandoned on a train platform that very morning. And she set her hands in her lap, and she did not think about Ohio, or the $23, or the letters tied with kitchen twine. She thought about the fever chart she was keeping in her head, and about the cut on his arm, and about how much water he'd need before morning. She had not come all this way to be defeated by a man's low expectations. She had come all this way to build a life. And whatever that life was going to be, she was going to build it herself, one careful, deliberate step at a time. She was still in the chair when morning came. She hadn't meant to sleep, but the body makes its own decisions when you've pushed it long enough, and somewhere in the deep quiet of the early hours, Amelia's chin had dropped, and her eyes had closed, and she had slept sitting upright with her hands folded in her lap, like a woman in a church pew. What woke her was the sound of Gideon's breathing, not worse, but different. Changed in a way she needed to assess. She was at the cot before she was fully awake. The fever had dropped. Not gone, not by a long way, but the terrible close heat radiating off his skin had pulled back from its worst edge. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and felt the difference, and something in her chest unclenched just slightly. His eyes opened. "You're still here," he said. The voice was rough from sleep and sickness, but it had more underneath it than the night before. More presence. The fever had burned less of him away overnight. "I said I would be," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You slept in that chair. I've slept in worse places." He didn't say anything to that. He looked at the ceiling and breathed in slow and deliberate, and she could still hear the rattle, but it was looser now, which was the right direction. His color was better. The gray under his skin had retreated. "I need to get up," he said, and began to push himself to sitting. "You need to drink something first," she said, and put a hand flat to his sternum without thinking, and pushed back. Not hard, just a clear and unambiguous signal. He stopped. He looked down at her hand on his chest, and then up at her face, and there was something in the look that wasn't quite surprise, but was in that neighborhood. "Miss Harris," he said. "Amelia," she said, "and you can get up after you've had water and I've looked at that arm. That's not a negotiation." A beat of silence. "You're a stubborn woman." "I'm a practical woman," she said. "There's a difference. Now sit up slow." He sat up slow. She got him water from the bucket she'd filled the night before, and he drank it steadily, all of it, without being told twice, which she marked as an improvement over the evening before. She unwrapped the cloth from his forearm and looked at the cut in the morning light. The red-purple margin had not spread in the night. The skin around the wound was still angry, but the deeper discoloration had not crept any further up toward his elbow. "It's holding," she said again. "You said that last night." "It's still true this morning. That's a good sign." She began to clean it again, fresh cloth, fresh water. "Does it hurt more or less than yesterday?" "Same," he said. "That's honest." "I try to be." She worked carefully, and he let her, which cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way a self-sufficient man accepts help he didn't ask for and didn't want, and cannot argue himself out of needing. There was a particular kind of dignity in it that she recognized. She had practiced it herself for the better part of 20 years. "You haven't eaten," she said. "No." "I have hard cheese. It's not much." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm going to anyway." She cut the cheese from the round Frances had packed and set half of it on the cloth beside him and kept half for herself, and neither of them made any ceremony of it. He ate. She ate. The morning light came in through the single window, and the room was quiet in a way that had shifted from the night before. Not the silence of a place where someone was dying, but the silence of a place where two people were thinking separately, but in the same direction. "You said your grandmother taught you," Gideon said. "She did." "Where'd she learn it?" Amelia considered. "Her mother." and her mother's mother before that. Women in my family figured out early that if you waited for a doctor to come to you, you'd be waiting in a box. She folded the cloth between her hands. My grandmother could identify 47 plants by sight and tell you what each one was good for and what it would kill you with if you used it wrong. I know maybe 30 of them. I'm still learning the rest. He chewed, watching her. You talk about her like she's gone. She is. 4 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. She looked at the window. She was the one who told me to answer the advertisement. She said a woman with good sense could make a home anywhere if she went toward it with her eyes open. A pause. I think she meant that as encouragement. Maybe it still is, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the far wall, not at her, and he said it plainly without decoration, the way a man says something he means but hasn't thought out all the implications of yet. There was no flattery in it. That was what made it land the way it did. It was just a thing he believed stated straight, offered with the same directness he seemed to use for everything. She didn't answer it, but she didn't look away from his face either, not for a long moment. By mid-morning he was sitting up on his own, and she was coaxing the stove back to life with the intention of boiling water for broth when she heard horses outside. 2 horses moving at a purposeful pace, stopping in the yard. She straightened up from the stove and looked at Gideon, and his expression had changed, a tightening across his jaw, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. You know who that is, she said. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. The knock on the door was sharp. 3 fast raps, the knock of someone who doesn't expect to be kept waiting. Gideon moved to stand, and she put a hand to his shoulder. I'll get it, she said. You're not on your feet yet. Amelia. I said I'll get it. She crossed to the door and opened it. Ethan Wilder stood in the doorway. He was dressed cleaner than he'd been at the train platform, had a better hat on, had the look of a man who had ridden 3 miles and arrived intending to be the authority in whatever room he entered. Beside him was a younger man, lanky and watchful, with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who has been brought along as a witness and isn't entirely sure he wants the job. Ethan's eyes found her face, and something crossed his expression that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite anger. It was the look of a man who expected a situation to have resolved itself in his absence and found it stubbornly persisting. Miss Harris, he said. Mr. Wilder, she said, and did not move out of the doorway. I came to see my brother. Your brother is unwell. He's been sick for close to 4 days. He's improving, but he's not up to visitors who are going to tire him out. Something hardened in Ethan's jaw. He's my brother. I think I have the right. You rode 3 miles this morning, she said. Where were you 4 days ago when he was 3 days into a fever that could have killed him? She kept her voice even and her stance steady in the doorframe. He's better than he was last night. I'd like to keep him that way. So if you want to see him, you can see him for 10 minutes, and you can speak calmly and not about anything that's going to work him up. The young man beside Ethan shifted his weight and looked at his boots. Ethan stared at her. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had gone to the place men's eyes go when they are calculating whether what they are dealing with is an obstacle or a fixed wall. She held his gaze and let him do the calculation. Fine, he said finally. 10 minutes. She stepped back and let him in. She did not step far back. She stayed where she could hear everything. Gideon was sitting up on the cot when his brother came in, and she watched the way the 2 men looked at each other, the long look between brothers who have a complicated history, who have perhaps not spoken freely in years. Gideon's face had gone careful and neutral. Ethan's had done something between relief and something older and less comfortable. You look like death, Ethan said. I'm improving, Gideon said. You should have sent word. To who? Ethan stopped. The question sat between them without a good answer, and both men knew it. You could have sent to town, Ethan said. Someone would have come. Someone did come, Gideon said, and his eyes moved briefly to Amelia without making a performance of it. Ethan followed the look. She saw the sequence on his face recognition calculation, the small adjustment men make when a situation is not what they expected. He turned back to Gideon. I came to talk to you about the north fence line, he said. The Holts are saying it's moved. I want to ride it with you once you're up." "I know about the fence line," Gideon said. "It hasn't moved." "Then we need to show Holt that, and that means riding it together." "Give me a week," Gideon said. "I'll ride it with you." Ethan nodded. But he didn't leave. He stood for a moment with his hat in his hands and looked at his brother with the expression of a man who came intending to say one thing and finds he perhaps should say another and cannot quite get himself there. His eyes cut to Amelia again standing at the far side of the room, and this time they stayed on her a beat longer. She met his eyes and did not look away. Something moved through his face. Not apology. She did not think apology was a place Ethan Wilder got to easily. But something. An acknowledgement. The small, uncomfortable recognition of a thing not done right. He didn't say anything. He put his hat back on and said, "I'll come back at the end of the week," to Gideon, and he left. The young man who'd ridden out with him had not come inside at all. Amelia closed the door and turned back to find Gideon watching her from the cot. He had the look of a man who has just watched something happen that he expected to go differently. "Most people don't stop Ethan in a doorway," he said. "I noticed he expected that," she said, and went back to the stove. She heard what might have been a sound behind her that might have been a quiet laugh. She chose not to make an event of it. He slept again in the afternoon, and she used the time to do the things that needed doing, brought water in from the well, fed the gray horse in the corral, who accepted her without suspicion, and pressed his big forehead briefly to her shoulder in a way that made her throat tighten. Unexpectedly found the small store of food in the lean-to beside the cabin, and took stock of what was there. There was enough for 3 or 4 days if she was careful. She was always careful. When she went back inside, Gideon was awake and watching the ceiling with the expression of a man turning something over in his mind. "The horse is fed," she said. "His name is Copper," Gideon said. "He's a steady animal." "Best horse I've ever had." A pause. "He doesn't take to strangers easy." "He took to me easy enough," she said. Gideon turned his head and looked at her. "Yes, he did," he said, and something in the way he said it was considering more than just the horse. That evening he was well enough to sit up fully and take the broth she made from the little she had, and the color in his face had moved from sick toward something that was simply his own. The fever was there still, but low now, manageable, the kind that breaks on its own if you keep a person properly watered and fed and rested. She'd seen it before. She knew what it looked like when a body turned the corner. "You're going to be all right," she told him, not as comfort, but as assessment. The way her grandmother had always said it, not to soothe, but to inform. He looked at her across the small table. They had not eaten at a table together before he had been on the cot. She had been in the chair, and this was different in a way she didn't examine too closely. He had his big hands wrapped around the bowl, and he was looking at her with those steady gray eyes, and the expression of a man who is about to say something he has been considering for several hours. "What are you going to do?" he said. "After." She looked at the bowl in her own hands. "After you're well, you mean?" "Yes." "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I have enough money for a few weeks at the hotel if I'm careful. Mrs. Dodd mentioned there might be washing work in town." She kept her voice practical because she was a practical woman, and because the alternative, the space beneath the practicality, where the fear lived, was not a place she was going to let herself go at this particular table. "I'll find something. This ranch needs a cook," he said, "and someone who knows what to do when a man's too stubborn to take care of himself." She looked up at him. He was looking at the table now, not at her. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering work. Fair wage, your own room in the lean-to addition. It's small, but it's clean. You'd be doing a job that needs doing, and doing it better than it's been done in years." He paused. "I reckon you already know what answer I'd give if someone tried to offer me charity, so I won't insult you by dressing it up as something it isn't." Amelia set her bowl down carefully. She had spent the last 24 hours in this man's house, had put her hands on his fever-hot skin, and his infected arm and his chest to push him back when he tried to rise too fast, had fed his horse and boiled his water, and argued his brother out of his own doorway. She had not done any of it for payment. She had done it because it needed doing, and she was the one there to do it. But she also had $23, and a future that was a blank page, and a practical woman knew the value of solid ground. "A fair wage," she said. "Whatever Mrs. Dodd pays for washing, I'll match it and add $2 a month on top," he said, for the medical knowing. She considered him. He was still looking at the table. There was something almost careful in his stillness, the way a man is careful when he's made an offer that matters to him and is waiting to find out if it's going to be refused. "All right," she said. He looked up, just briefly, then back to the table. "All right," he said, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted in a way that was not dramatic and not small. They finished the broth in silence. Outside the window, the stars were coming in, thick over the Arizona dark, more stars than she had ever seen in Ohio, more than she had known were possible. She had not looked at stars in a long time with anything other than the feeling of being very small and very alone. She looked at them now through the glass, and the feeling was different, not entirely gone, but changed, diluted by something she couldn't name precisely. She washed the bowls. She set the willow bark to steep one more time. "You should sleep in the chair again," Gideon said from the cot. "That thing'll kill your back, but it's better than the floor." "I've managed worse," she said. "I know you have," he said. "That's not the point." She stood with her back to him, and the words moved through her like the river her grandmother had described. The thing that passes through you and leaves something behind. He said it without looking for credit. He said it the way he said everything, straight, no ornamentation. The truth, with nothing decorative hanging off it. He knew she had managed worse. He was saying that she didn't have to. She did not turn around. She looked at the dark window. "Thank you, Gideon," she said. A long pause, then his voice low and already heading toward sleep. "Thank you, Amelia." She settled into the chair with her coat over her shoulders and the fire low in the stove, and the sound of his breathing steadier than it had been the night before, and she did not think about Ohio, or rejection, or the letter of her grandmother's last words to her, packed at the bottom of a trunk 3 miles away in a storekeeper's back room. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about the horse named Copper, who had pressed his forehead to her shoulder. She thought about a man who said fair wage, and meant it, who had looked at her in a doorway and said, "You're still here," and seemed in a way she was very carefully not reading too much into, to be glad about it. The fire settled. The room breathed. Tomorrow she would start building. The fever broke on the 4th morning. Amelia knew it before she touched him. She heard it in his breathing. First, the way the tight, waterlogged pull of it had finally loosened into something longer and cleaner. And when she crossed to the cot and put her hand to his forehead, the skin was damp with sweat but cool. Not sick cool. The cool of a body that has finished fighting and won. She stood there for a moment with her hand on his forehead and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief before she went to get him water. He drank it sitting up on his own with his back straight, and he looked different in the morning light without the fever behind his eyes. Clearer. More present. The gray eyes were sharp in a way they hadn't been since she arrived, and he looked at her with the full direct attention of a man who was no longer burning from the inside and was taking proper stock of his circumstances. "The arm," he said. "Better? The red margin has been pulling back since yesterday afternoon. Another 3 days of cleaning and it should close, clean." He looked at the wrapped forearm, then back at her. "You kept track of it. The margin. Every time I cleaned it. You track what you can so you know what's moving in the right direction." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say a good rancher knows his land inch by inch. Every fence post, every water line, every weak spot in the soil." He paused. "You work the same way." She looked at him. He said it as an observation, not a compliment, and she took it the way it was offered plainly between two people who understood the value of paying attention. "I suppose I do," she said. He swung his legs off the cot before she could argue with him about it, and she made a sound, and he held up a hand. "I'm getting up, Amelia. I've been flat on my back for 5 days. I am getting up." She crossed her arms. "Slow." "Slow," he agreed. He stood. He was unsteady. For one moment, she took a step toward him involuntarily and stopped herself, and then he found his balance and stood full height, and the room seemed slightly smaller with him upright in it. He was a large man, she had registered that on the first night, but lying sick on a cot and standing in the full morning light were two different things. He looked like a man who was made for the work he did, like someone the land had shaped on purpose. He took 3 careful steps toward the table and sat down in the chair and let out a long breath. "There," she said. "There." He agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved in the almost way it had been moving for 4 days. She made him eat before he did anything else. She had found dried beans in the lean-to and had them simmering before he was fully awake, and she set a bowl in front of him, and he ate without protest, which told her more about how much better he felt than any of his words would have. A man who is genuinely ill will not be managed. A man on the mend will eat what's put in front of him. She was washing the bowls when he said behind her, "I need to go check on Copper. I checked on Copper this morning." "You've been checking on my horse." "Someone had to." She set the bowl on the shelf. "He's fine. I refilled the trough and he had grain this morning." She turned around to find him watching her with an expression that had moved past assessment and into something slower and more careful. He looked like a man who had been keeping a tally without entirely meaning to, and had just noticed the column was longer than he expected. "Amelia," he said. "You're welcome," she said before he could make a production of gratitude he clearly found uncomfortable to produce. "That's what I'm here for." Something in his face settled. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a gracefully laid plank over an awkward gap. That afternoon, he was on his feet long enough to walk to the corral and back, Copper pressing his nose to his shoulder with what seemed like genuine reproach at the absence. And Gideon stood with his hand on the horse's neck, and they had some kind of exchange that didn't require words, and that Amelia watched from a discreet distance and did not interfere with. A man and his horse had their own language, and she had the good sense to let them speak it. He was tired by the time he came back inside, and he sat in the chair without being told, to which she also noted. "You have hands coming back in 4 days," she said from where she was sorting through the stores in the lean-to. He looked up. "How do you know that?" "You mentioned it when the fever was high. You talked some those first 2 nights." A beat of silence. "What else did I say?" She considered. "You argued about the fence line with someone named Holt. You told Copper he was a good horse approximately 6 times. And you said your mother's name once, but you said it quiet, and I didn't hear what came after." He was still. The stillness he did when something touched a place he kept private. She watched him process it and did not push. "She died when I was 14, he said finally. "I know," she said. "Francis Dodd told me something of your family history. I hope that's all right." "Francis Dodd tells everyone something of everyone's family history," he said, and there was no meanness in it. It was simply true. "What did she tell you?" Amelia came and sat at the table across from him. She folded her hands in a way that was about to be straight. "She told me your mother died young, and your father ran the ranch hard, and Ethan was always the one who got on with your father, and you were always the one who didn't. She told me you built this homestead yourself, mostly alone, starting at 27. She told me you are, quote, the most reliable man in 3 counties and the most difficult to get to know." She paused. She said it as a compliment. He looked at her for a long moment. "And what do you think, now that you've spent 4 days getting to know me while I was too sick to stop you?" The question was direct in the way all his questions were direct, and she answered it the same way. "I think Francis Dodd was being accurate," she said. "And I think reliable is a fine thing to be." Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it. It was too quick and too layered, and it disappeared back behind the steadiness before she could get a clear look at it. "You're a fair woman," he said. "I try to be." He looked at the table. "Ethan," he said and stopped. He started again. "What he did at the station, I want you to know I would not have done it." "I know," she said. "You don't know me well enough to know that." "I know you well enough," she said quietly. A man who won't ask for help himself, but will let a woman he's never met change his fever cloth at 2 a.m. without making her feel unwelcome. That man does not leave a woman stranded on a train platform over a limp. She met his eyes. I know you well enough. The silence after that was a different kind. It had weight in it, the way silences do when something true has been said out loud and both people in the room are deciding what to do with it. He held her eyes for a count that was longer than necessary. And then he looked at the window, and she looked at her hands, and they let it be. It was 3 mornings after that when the town came to her. She was at the well when she heard the horses on the road, and she straightened and turned, and there were 4 of them coming up the gate track. Women she registered, which was different from the last time horses had come up that track. 3 women and 1 man, the man driving a small wagon with a covered basket in the back, and she recognized Francis Dodd in the seat beside him even at a distance. She stood at the well and waited. Francis climbed down from the wagon with the practiced ease of a woman who has been climbing off wagons for 50 years, and she came across the yard and looked at Amelia with her sharp face, and her white apron, and her expression of a woman who is bringing something and knows it, and isn't going to make speeches about it. "How is he?" she said. "Better. Up and walking. The fever broke 4 days ago." Francis's face moved in a way that was relief without announcement. She turned and gestured to the wagon, and the man lifted the covered basket down and brought it forward, and Francis took it and held it out to Amelia. "From the women in town," she said. "Flour, salt, pork, dried apples, 2 jars of preserves. Mrs. Holt sent eggs." Amelia looked at the basket. She looked at Francis. She looked at the 3 women still on horseback, watching her, one older to her own age, all of them with the careful expressions of people who have been following a situation and have arrived at a point where they have decided which side of it to be on. "That's very kind," she said. "It's what neighbors do," Francis said. "Ought to have been done sooner." Her eyes said the rest, the part about the platform, about Silver Creek standing by and watching. She didn't speak it. She just held the basket out further, and Amelia took it. One of the younger women on horseback cleared her throat. "Miss Harris," she said, and her voice was self-conscious in the way of a person making a correction they should have made sooner. "I'm Clara Holt. My husband's the one had the fence argument with Mr. Wilder. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how things went at the station. I should have said something." Amelia looked at her. Clara Holt was maybe 30 with an honest face and the slightly stricken expression of a woman who has been sitting with a guilt she finally got up the nerve to address. "You don't need to apologize for Ethan Wilder's choices," Amelia said. "No," Clara said. "But I was there and I didn't speak. That's its own thing." She met Amelia's eyes. "I'm speaking now." Amelia held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. One nod clean and accepting the way her grandmother had taught her to accept an honest thing offered honestly. "Appreciated," she said. Behind her the cabin door opened. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Gideon. She heard the step uneven, still careful, but present. And she heard from the women on horseback the small collective shift of people recalibrating. The sight of Gideon Wilder upright and walking clearly surprised at least 2 of the 4 who had come. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her. Beside her. She noticed that. "Francis," he said. "You look better than I expected," Francis said, which from Francis was nearly effusive. "She's a good nurse," he said. Simple stated the way he stated everything. His shoulder was a foot from Amelia's, and he was looking at the women on horseback with the measured gaze of a man taking stock of a development. "We were just telling Miss Harris she's welcome in Silver Creek," Clara Holt said. There was something in the way she said it, a statement aimed at something bigger than the words, a small public declaration that had nothing to do with welcome and everything to do with correction. Gideon's jaw moved. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, and his voice was quiet and absolutely even, and it landed in the yard like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples going out in all directions. There was no performance in it. It was just a man acknowledging that something had been wrong and something was being made right, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Francis handed over the basket fully to Amelia and looked between the 2 of them with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things in her life and is currently watching one of the more interesting ones. "I'll bring more next week," she said. "Salt pork won't last forever." "I'll come to the store," Amelia said. "I need to check on my trunk regardless." Frances nodded. Then she turned to her husband on the wagon, and the women on horseback arranged themselves to leave, and Clara Holt held Amelia's eyes for one last moment and gave a small nod that meant more than the words had, and then they were going back down the track and out the gate, and it was just the two of them again in the yard. Amelia stood with the basket. Gideon stood beside her. They watched the wagon and the horses go small on the road until the dust settled. "That's a change," she said. "Silver Creek moves slow," he said, "but it moves." She turned to go inside, and he fell into step beside her and held the door, and she went through it carrying the basket, and he followed and let the door close behind them, and neither of them remarked on any of it, because there was nothing that needed remarking on. She was at the stove going through the basket when he said from behind her, "Ethan's coming back end of the week. What he said at the platform, he won't leave it alone." She set down a jar of preserves. "What do you mean?" "I mean Ethan doesn't leave things alone that trouble him." He was at the table sitting, and she turned to look at him. His face was careful in the specific way it got when he was navigating something between himself and his brother, a kind of weary precision. "He came out here the other day to look at you, not the fence line, you." He wanted to understand what was happening. "And what's happening?" she said. She asked it plainly because she was a plain-spoken woman, and because she needed to know what he was going to say. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes and the weight behind them that always seemed to be holding more than it let out. "You're working here," he said. "That's what's happening. You're doing a job that needs doing, and you're doing it well, and you belong here as much as anyone. That's what I'll tell him." She held his gaze. "And if he doesn't accept that, then he'll deal with me," Gideon said. No heat in it, no drama. Just the flat, immovable certainty of a man who has decided a thing and means it all the way to the ground. Amelia turned back to the basket. She lifted out the dried apples and the salt pork, and she set them on the shelf with hands that were steady, and she was glad her back was to him because something had moved through her at those words. Something that was not small and not simple, and that she was not ready to put a name to yet. She was unpacking the second jar of preserves when she heard him push back from the table. "Amelia," he said. She turned. He was standing, and he was looking at her with something on his face she had not seen there before. Not the fever, not the careful steadiness, not the almost laugh. Something slower. Something that had been building since the first morning she woke up in that chair, and he'd said, "You're still here like a man waking from a bad dream, to find the world still intact. I want you to know," he said, and stopped, and she could see him choosing words, the way a man chooses footing on uncertain ground, carefully, deliberately, not rushing the step. "I want you to know that whatever Ethan does or doesn't do, whatever this town did or didn't do when you came off that train," his jaw tightened once, then released. "What happened to you at that station was wrong. And I don't intend to let it stand as the last word on who you are or what you're worth. Not while you're on this land." The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time. This man who had barely spoken when she arrived, who had let her change his fever cloth without asking why, who had said fair wage and matched it with fair action, who had stood beside her in the yard and told a woman on horseback that he was glad she was welcome. This man was standing in his own kitchen, telling her that the humiliation she had walked into this town carrying was not the end of her story. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, and she meant it with everything she had. He nodded. Once. Then he sat back down, and she turned back to the shelf, and they went on with the evening, and the food went on the shelf, and the stove went on burning, and outside the stars came up over Arizona, the way they always did, indifferent and immense and beautiful in spite of it. But something had changed in the room. Both of them knew it. Neither of them spoke of it. And somewhere on the road between Silver Creek and the Wilder homestead, Ethan was riding back toward his own ranch with his own thoughts, and whatever those thoughts were, they were the kind that don't let a man sleep easy. And Amelia, who had learned from 4 days of fever watch to notice when a situation was turning a corner, felt it. She was not wrong to. Ethan came back on a Friday. Amelia heard him before she saw him. The particular rhythm of his horse on the hard road, faster than a man coming to check on his brother, the pace of a man who had made up his mind about something and was coming to act on it. She was at the well when he rode through the gate, and she stood straight and watched him come and did not move to go inside. He pulled up short when he saw her. Then he dismounted. "Miss Harris," he said. "Mr. Wilder." She set the water bucket down. "Your brother's at the north fence line. He'll be back within the hour." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't come for Gideon." She waited. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands, the same gesture she'd seen on the platform, but different in quality. Less dismissive. More like a man doing something with his hands because he doesn't know what to do with them. "I came to speak with you," he said, "if you'll allow it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she gestured toward the two chairs outside the cabin door. "All right," she said. They sat. Ethan put his hat on his knee and looked at the ground between his boots for a beat that stretched longer than was comfortable, and Amelia sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing, because she had found over the years that silence does more work than most people give it credit for. "I treated you badly at the station," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "You did." He flinched at the directness of it. She suspected he had come expecting her to soften it, for him to say something like, "It's all right," or "It was a difficult situation." The small diplomatic lies women offer men to make an apology easier to finish. She didn't offer them. He had asked for honesty by showing up, and she was going to give him what he asked for. "I read your letters again," he said. "After you came out here and I rode back that first day. I went home and I read every one of them." She was quiet. "You said it plain," he said. "The injury, the limp. You said it plain and I read it and I thought..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I thought it would be different seeing it on paper than seeing it in front of me. I thought I'd be able to manage it." He looked up at her now. "That's a poor excuse. I know that." "It is," she said. "I'm not a man who's good at being wrong," he said. "I've noticed that," she said. "About both of you." Something moved through his face. Something almost like a ghost of acknowledgement. "We're Wilders," he said. "It's a family failing." "You can choose to fail differently," she said. "That's always an option." He held her eyes. "I am sorry, Miss Harris, for what it's worth coming this late." Amelia looked at him and did the work of assessing him the way she assessed everything, not with the heat of the moment, but with the clear-eyed patience her grandmother had taught her. Ethan Wilder was a man built by the same rough materials as his brother, but assembled differently. The pieces fitted together with more pride and less grace. And he had come out here on a Friday with his hat in his hands and said the thing that cost him something to say. "That was not nothing. It's worth something," she said. "Not everything, but something." He nodded. He put his hat back on. And then, because apparently he was not done, he said, "What's happening here between you and Gideon?" She looked at him steadily. "That's not your question to ask." "He's my brother. He's a grown man who runs his own land," she said. "What's between us is between us. I'll tell you what I'll tell anyone who asks. I work here. I'm earning my place here, and I'm not going anywhere because someone finds my presence inconvenient." A long beat. Then Ethan nodded slow. "He looks better than I've seen him in years," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something careful and honest underneath the surface of it, that was not about illness at all. She heard Copper on the road before Gideon came through the gate, and she saw Ethan hear it too, and both of them went quiet in their separate ways. Gideon saw his brother's horse before he saw his brother, and she watched his face from across the yard go through the sequence she had come to know. The tightening, the careful neutrality, the decision. He came into the yard and dismounted and tied Copper, and he walked toward them with his steady, unhurried pace, and his gray eyes moving between the two of them, reading the situation without asking for a report. "Ethan," he said. "Gideon." Ethan stood. "I came to apologize to Miss Harris, and to talk to you about the fence line if you've got the time." Gideon looked at Amelia. She gave him nothing to read in her face. She let him take his own measure of the room. He looked back at his brother. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put on coffee." She let them have it. The brother conversation, the fence line discussion, the particular male language of practical matters that often carries emotional weight in its undertow. She went to the lean-to and she worked, and she let them have their hour, and when Ethan rode out an hour later, he tipped his hat to her as he passed, and it was a different tip than the one at the platform. Fuller, more honest. She watched him go and felt something settle that had been unsettled since the moment she stepped off the train. Gideon came to stand beside her. "Well," she said. "He won't be a problem," he said. "He wasn't a problem," she said. "He was a man who did wrong and came to say so. That's not a problem. That's just someone working through who they are." He looked at her sideways. "You're more generous to him than I expected." "I'm not generous," she said. "I'm accurate. There's a difference." She turned toward the cabin. "You said that was the family failing, being wrong." "Did I?" "He did. About both of you." She went inside without waiting to see his face, but she heard him behind her following, and she heard the sound that was almost and not quite a laugh, and she was smiling when she got to the stove, and she was glad he couldn't see it. It was 4 days after Ethan's visit when the second thing happened. She was in the dry goods store. She had walked the 3 miles herself, her hip managing it better than it had the first time, the road familiar. Now in the way roads become familiar when you've walked them with intention. And she was talking with Francis about preserves. When the door opened and a woman came in whose name Amelia did not know, but whose expression she recognized immediately. It was the expression of a woman on an errand that is not entirely her own. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed by Silver Creek standards, with a tight mouth and the particular posture of a person who has status in a small community and is accustomed to wielding it. "Miss Harris," she said, and did not make it sound like a greeting. "Ma'am," Amelia said. Francis had gone very still behind the counter, in the way of a person who knows exactly what is about to happen. "I'm Margaret Fowler," the woman said. "My husband is the county land assessor. I want to speak plainly with you." "I prefer plain speaking," Amelia said. "Go ahead." Margaret Fowler folded her hands at her waist. "There are people in this town who are concerned about your arrangement with Gideon Wilder, an unmarried woman living on a man's property." "I work on his property," Amelia said. "I live in the lean-to addition, which has its own door and its own lock. I cook and manage the household in exchange for a fair wage. That's an employment arrangement. It's the same arrangement half the households in this county have with someone." "It's not the same," Margaret said. "Those arrangements are not what?" Amelia said, and her voice was quiet and absolutely level. "Are not with a woman who arrived under embarrassing circumstances. Are not with someone this town would prefer, had gotten back on the eastbound train and made the whole situation tidier." She took one step toward Margaret Fowler. Not aggressive, just clear. "I did not do anything wrong, Mrs. Fowler. I answered an honest advertisement honestly. What happened to me at that station was not my doing. And I have built something decent since then, and I am not going to stand here and be told to be ashamed of it." Margaret's mouth had gone tight enough to lose color. "I'm only saying what people are—" "I know what people are saying," Amelia said. "And I know why they're saying it. And I'm telling you as plainly as I can that what I do and where I live and how I earn my wage is not the town's business unless I make it so, which I haven't." The door opened. She did not take her eyes off Margaret Fowler for a second, but she heard the step, and she knew it. Gideon's voice came from behind her. "Margaret." Margaret Fowler blinked. She had not expected him. "Mr. Wilder," she said, and the authority in her voice shifted like a chair with one short leg. "I came to pick up the order Francis put together." He came to stand beside Amelia, not in front of her, beside her, and close enough that it was a statement without words. "Is there something I can help you with?" Margaret looked between them. Something in her face recalculated. "I was just speaking with Miss Harris," she said. "I heard some of it," he said. He said it flat and without heat, and it was devastating in its simplicity. He had heard. He was saying he had heard, and he was standing where he was standing and not moving. Margaret's hands tightened at her waist. The town only wants to— The town, Gideon said carefully, can concern itself with its own arrangements. Amelia Harris works for me, earns a fair wage, and conducts herself with more dignity than most people I know. If someone in this town has a concern about that, I'd be glad to hear it from them directly. He paused. Directly. Not through conversation in the dry goods store. The silence was absolute. Margaret Fowler looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Amelia. And something passed through her expression that was not comfortable and was not an apology, but was adjacent to both the look of a woman who has pushed on something and found it more solid than she expected, and is now deciding how to leave the room with what remains of her purpose intact. "Good day, then," she said, and left. The door closed. Frances let out a breath behind the counter that sounded like it had been held for the duration of a long sermon. Amelia stood still. She was aware of Gideon beside her, the close proximity of him, the warmth of it, the fact that he had come in and stood where he stood without being asked and without making a performance of it. She was aware of all of it with a precision that had nothing to do with her grandmother's medical training. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I had it." "I know you did." He did not move away. "She needed to hear it from me, too. In this town, she needed to hear it from me." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the door Margaret Fowler had gone through. His jaw set, his eyes still carrying the weight of the thing he'd said, and she looked at his profile, the line of it, the steadiness of it, and felt something move through her that was not a river this time, not passing through and leaving. It was the kind of feeling that stays, that settles in and builds a floor. "Gideon," she said. He turned and looked at her. The gray eyes were close and direct, and they held something she had been watching build for 2 weeks and had been carefully not naming. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He reached past her to take the wrapped order Frances had set on the counter, and the gesture brought him briefly closer, and neither of them moved to make it shorter than it was. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They walked back to the ranch together in the afternoon light, 3 miles on hard-packed road, and Amelia's hip worked through it the way it always did, unevenly, persistently, without apology, and Gideon walked beside her at her pace, not accommodating it, not making a point of it, simply walking at the speed they were walking together. Nobody adjusted. Nobody explained. It was just the pace. About a mile out, he said, "Margaret Fowler's husband assessed this land when I first registered the homestead. He tried to undervalue it so the record would show less than it was worth." Amelia looked at him. "What did you do?" "I got a second assessment from the county office in Prescott and filed it alongside his." He paused. "She's never forgiven me for it." "So this wasn't about me," Amelia said. "Or not only. It was about you," he said. "And it was about 14 years of Margaret Fowler deciding what Silver Creek is allowed to be." He was quiet for a beat. "You just gave her a reason to bring it to your door." "She found the wrong door," Amelia said. He looked at her sideways. "Yes, she did." They walked. The road turned east past the split rock, and the desert was loud around them with the afternoon insects and the dry wind and all its own indifferent business. She was thinking about what he had said in the cabin a week ago, not going to let it stand as the last word. She was thinking about the way he had walked into the dry goods store and stood beside her like a man taking a position he had already decided on long before the moment required it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. She looked ahead at the road. "Why did you send your hands to the summer pasture before you were sick? The real reason." A long pause. The road went on. "I knew I was getting ill," he said. "I knew it was going to be bad, and He stopped, started again with the care of a man not used to this particular kind of honesty. "I didn't want anyone to see it, didn't want the hands watching me go down, didn't want to need anything from anyone on my own land." "That's a lonely way to be," she said. "It's the only way I knew," he said. She nodded. She thought about that a man so long without someone beside him that he had made a system out of the solitude had built it into policy. She thought about what it had cost him to lie in that cot for 5 days and let her give him water and medicine and broth and the firm pressure of her hand on his sternum when he tried to get up before he should. "It doesn't have to be the only way," she said, and she said it quietly, not pressing, just setting it down. He didn't answer for a long time. Then, so quietly she almost lost it to the wind. "No, I don't reckon it does." She looked at the road. He looked at the road. They walked the last mile to the gate in silence. But it was the kind of silence that had been growing between them for 2 weeks. Not empty, not awkward, but full of something that neither of them was in a rush to name, because some things need to be felt thoroughly before they can be spoken without diminishing them. He held the gate open, and she went through, and he followed and let it swing shut behind them, and Copper lifted his head from the corral and made a low sound, and Gideon raised a hand toward him automatically, and the horse dropped his head again. At the cabin door she stopped. He stopped beside her. "She'll come back," she said. "Margaret Fowler, or someone like her." "Probably," he said. "And there'll be others. People who think what I am isn't worth this land or this work or—" She stopped because she had been about to say something else, something that lived below the work and the land, and she was not ready. "Let them come," he said. And this time there was something in his voice she had not heard there before. Not the flat certainty of a man holding a position. Something warmer. Something that was about more than the land or the town or the woman who had tried to shame her in a dry goods store. It was about her, and it was the first time he had said anything to her that was unmistakably, entirely specifically about her. She looked up at him. He was looking at her. The evening was coming in, and the light was going amber and long, and he was looking at her the way a man looks when he has stopped calculating and started simply seeing. "Gideon," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I know," he said. As if she had said the whole thing, as if he had been waiting for it and it didn't need finishing. "I know Amelia," she breathed. The air was warm and dry and smelled of creosote and the last heat of the day, and she was standing in a yard that was not hers and was not hers, on land that had grown familiar under her feet. In 2 weeks, the way some land does, the way it did for her grandmother, who said, "You don't choose home. Home chooses you, and you feel it in the soles of your feet before you feel it anywhere else." She felt it. She had been feeling it for days. She had just been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending she didn't. "All right then," she said softly. And Gideon Wilder, who had spent 14 years building something alone on this hard Arizona ground, nodded once and opened the door and waited for her to go in first. She did not sleep well that night, not because anything was wrong, because something was right, and she had been braced against wrong for so long that right felt like a new country she didn't yet know how to navigate in the dark. She lay in the lean-to with her hands folded on her chest and listened to the quiet of the ranch and the distant sound of Copper shifting in the corral, and she thought about what Gideon had said. "I know Amelia," and the way he had said it, like a man acknowledging something that had been true for longer than the moment it was spoken. She was up before dawn. She had the stove going and the coffee on before the light changed, and when Gideon came out of the cabin, he stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked at her at the stove, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not yet words and did not need to be yet. "Coffee's ready," she said. "I can smell it," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did. They drank it at the table together, and he told her the hands were coming back from summer pasture in 2 days, and she told him she'd need to know how many they were feeding, and he told her 3, including himself. And she said she'd need more flour, then, and he said he'd go to Francis today, and she said she'd go herself because she needed thread anyway. He said he'd take her in the wagon. She said she could walk. He said 3 miles in the heat with a full supply order on the way back was not what she was going to do. And he said it in the quiet way he said things that were not arguments, they were just facts he'd already decided. And she looked at him over her coffee cup and decided to let him have it. Not because she couldn't walk 3 miles, but because there was a difference between managing alone and choosing not to, and her grandmother had taught her that too. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he said, and drank his coffee. It was an ordinary morning. It was the most ordinary morning she had spent in years, and it sat in her chest like something lit. They were halfway to Silver Creek in the wagon when Gideon said, "The Hands are good men. Tom's been with me 8 years. Denny's younger, talks more than he works some days, but he's loyal." A pause. "They'll be respectful. If they're not, they'll answer for it." She looked at the road ahead. "You told them about me. I sent word to the pasture after the first week. Told them I'd been sick and that Amelia Harris was managing the household and to behave accordingly when they came back." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road, both hands easy on the reins. "You sent them a letter introducing me," she said. "I sent them instructions," he said, "which included who you were." She faced forward again. He had sent a letter to his ranch hands telling them to treat her right before she had even confirmed she was staying. Before the conversation about fair wage had even concluded. She rolled that over in her mind and felt the weight of it, not the romantic weight of a gesture, but the deeper, more solid weight of a man who acts on his conclusions before he announces them, who had decided she belonged before the world had agreed. "Gideon," she said. How long have you—" She stopped. She started again. "When did you decide that I was staying? That it was going to be this?" He was quiet for a beat, 2 beats. The wagon rolled on the hard road. "The first morning," he said, "when I woke up and you were still in the chair." She pressed her lips together and looked at the sky and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be less than what she felt. Frances Dodd saw them come in together and said absolutely nothing, but the look on her face was the look of a woman whose private calculations have just been confirmed and who is taking appropriate satisfaction in it. She helped Amelia fill the supply order with brisk efficiency, and when Gideon was loading the wagon, she caught Amelia's arm lightly at the counter. "Margaret Fowler's been talking," she said low and direct, "about you and the ranch. She's been to see the Reverend." Amelia went still. "About what specifically?" "About impropriety. About what it looks like to the community. She's building something. I don't know how far she'll take it, but I wanted you to know." Frances held her eyes. "She's got influence with 3 or 4 of the leading families. If she gets the Reverend on her side, she'll bring it to the town meeting." "When's the town meeting?" Amelia said. 12 days. She thanked Frances and went outside and did not tell Gideon immediately. She needed to think first, to turn it over the way her grandmother had taught her to turn a problem all the way around every surface before you decide where to apply pressure. She told him on the road home. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to rely on about him. He let you finish. Before he responded, he didn't run ahead of the information. When she was done, he was quiet for a full minute. "She won't stop," he said. "No," Amelia said. "She won't. Not unless she's given something she can't argue against." He looked at the road. "What can't she argue against?" Amelia looked at her hands in her lap. Her heart was doing something that was not its usual steady work. She was about to say something she had not planned to say today, had not planned to say this week, had in fact been holding at a careful arm's length, because she was a practical woman who did not rush toward things just because she wanted them. But she was also a woman who had crossed half a country on a word and who had learned that waiting for the perfect moment was just fear wearing patience's clothing. "She can't argue against a wife," Amelia said. The wagon went on rolling, the horse's hooves on the road, the dry wind, nothing else for a long moment. "No," Gideon said slowly. "She can't. I'm not saying it as a solution to Margaret Fowler," she said quickly because she needed him to know that. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because I've known it was true for more days than I'm comfortable admitting, and because this morning you told me you decided the first night, and I think the honest thing is for me to tell you the same." He pulled the wagon to a stop. She looked at him. He had the reins in both hands, and he was looking at her with the full weight of those gray eyes and everything that lived behind them, And it was a different look than she had seen before. Not the assessment, not the fever haze, not the careful steadiness. This was a man who had just heard something that had moved all the way through him and reached ground. "Are you asking me?" he said. "I'm telling you where I stand," she said. "And I'm asking what you want to do about it." He set the reins down. He turned on the bench to face her fully, and he reached out and took her hand. Both of his hands around one of hers, the way you hold something you've been careful with for weeks and can finally hold properly. And he said, "Amelia Harris, I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I am not a man who says things before he's sure of them. I am sure of this. I have been sure since you told a sick and stubborn stranger not to fight you on it, and then proved you right about everything." His hands tightened slightly. "I am asking you, if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had sent letters to his ranch hands, who had stood in her doorway, who had walked beside her at her pace without adjusting and without explaining. Who had said, "I know Amelia," like the words had been waiting. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." Something broke open in his face. It was not dramatic. It was the way something breaks open when it has been held carefully for a long time and is finally allowed to be what it is. A loosening, a warmth, a thing becoming larger than the space it had been kept in. He was not a man who performed emotion. He was a man who felt it all the way down quietly, without audience. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his jaw, a gesture so private and so certain that she felt it in her sternum like a bell struck once and still ringing. And then he picked up the reins and set the horse moving again, and they went the rest of the way home in silence. That was the fullest silence she had ever sat inside of. The hands came back 2 days later. Tom was 40, built like a man who had been doing hard work since before he could read, with a weathered face and the quiet, direct manner of someone who had taken his instructions seriously. He shook her hand and called her ma'am, and said he understood she'd saved the boss's life, and that made her family as far as he was concerned. And he said it so simply and so completely that she had to look at the water trough for a moment before she could answer. Denny was 22 and did talk more than he worked, but he was good-natured about it, and he had the disarming quality of a young man who is fully aware of his own failings and considers them charming, which sometimes they were. He called her Miss Amelia from the first hour, and by the end of the first day was asking her opinion on everything from the best way to treat a rope blister to whether Tom's cooking had always been that bad. "It has," Tom said from across the yard without looking up from what he was doing. "It truly has," Gideon said. It was the first time she had heard him say something purely for the warmth of it, without any practical weight underneath, just because it was the kind of thing you say when there are people around you, and the evening is easy, and the work is done. She stood in the doorway of the cabin with a dishcloth in her hands, and she looked at the three of them in the yard, and something in her chest expanded past its previous edges. This was a home. It had been growing into one for 3 weeks, and she was only now letting herself see the full shape of it. The town meeting was in 9 days. She and Gideon went to see Reverend Marsh 4 days before it. It was Gideon's idea, which surprised her. He was not a church-going man in the regular sense. He had told her that plainly, that he believed in God the way he believed in the land, directly and without intermediary. But he understood institutions, and he understood that Margaret Fowler's influence ran through Reverend Marsh like water through a channel, and the most effective thing to do with a channel is redirect it. Reverend Marsh was a thin man in his 50s, with careful eyes and the expression of someone who weighs his words before spending them. He welcomed them into his office and offered them chairs and looked between them with the particular alertness of a man who already knows this meeting is going to be more substantial than a social call. Gideon spoke first. "You've heard things about the arrangement at my ranch," he said, not a question. "I've heard some concerns raised," the Reverend said carefully. "I want to address them directly." Gideon looked at him straight. Amelia Harris came to Silver Creek in good faith, was treated badly on her arrival, and has since conducted herself with more integrity than half the people in this town who are currently discussing her reputation. She is employed on my land, earns a fair wage, and lives in her own quarters. He paused. She has also agreed to be my wife. We plan to marry before the month is out. I want you to know that directly from me, so that whatever is being said at the town meeting has the correct information attached to it. Reverend Marsh looked at Amelia. She held his eyes. Is this your own free choice, Miss Harris? He said, not challenging, asking. Genuinely asking the way a man of conscience asks when he wants to be sure of the answer. It is, she said. Entirely my own. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon. Then he folded his hands on the desk and said, I'll speak at the town meeting. I'll say what I know to be true. He paused. I'll also say that a community that concerns itself more with judging a woman's misfortune than with correcting the behavior that caused it has its priorities considerably out of order. His eyes held a dryness that was almost humor. I've been meaning to say something to that effect for several weeks. They walked out of the Reverend's office into the afternoon, and Amelia felt something lift off her shoulders that she had been carrying since the train platform, not entirely, not all at once, but significantly, like a coat you've worn so long in cold weather that when you finally step into the warmth, you have to remind yourself you're allowed to take it off. He'll hold, Gideon said. Yes, she said. He will. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were on the main street of Silver Creek, and people were moving around them in the afternoon business of a small town. A woman with a market basket, a man leading a horse, two boys running a direction that suggested trouble was either ahead of or behind them. All of it ordinary. All of it in this moment somehow luminous. I want to write to my cousin in Ohio, she said, before the wedding. She's the only family I have left, and I want her to know. Write to her today, he said. Frances can get the letter out on tomorrow's post. She looked at him. You want to do it quickly. I want to do it right, he said. There's a difference. She smiled. It started small, and then it didn't stay small, and she turned her face toward the street, so the whole of Silver Creek wasn't watching her smile at Gideon Wilder on the main road, and she heard him beside her doing the almost sound that was not quite a laugh. Come on, he said. Frances needs to know so she can tell everyone before we do. Is that how it works? She said, starting to walk. In Silver Creek, he said. That is absolutely how it works. The town meeting came, and the Reverend spoke, and Margaret Fowler sat in the third row with the expression of a woman watching her own argument be carefully and respectfully dismantled, and finding it a less comfortable experience than she had anticipated. 3 of the leading families said their piece, which was largely the piece Reverend Marsh had already made, and Clara Holt stood up near the end and said that in her view, Amelia Harris was the best thing to come to Silver Creek in the last 5 years, and if the town had half her backbone, it would be in considerably better shape. And there was a smattering of agreement that was louder than anyone had expected. Margaret Fowler did not speak. She left early before the vote on the water rights issue that had technically been the meeting's purpose, and Frances caught Amelia's eye across the room and gave her the single raised eyebrow that served in Frances Dodd's considerable vocabulary of expression as a standing ovation. They were married on a Saturday 3 weeks from the day Amelia Harris had dragged her trunk off the train platform and started walking. Reverend Marsh officiated. Tom and Denny stood on Gideon's side. Frances Dodd and Clara Holt stood on Amelia's. The ceremony was in the small church, and it was not elaborate, and it did not need to be, because the thing it was marking had been built carefully and with full attention over 3 weeks of fever cloths and hard cheese and morning coffee, and a man who had stood beside her in every doorway that mattered. When the Reverend asked if she took this man, she looked at Gideon's face, at the gray eyes that had fixed on her through a fever that had looked at her like a man who has stopped calculating and started simply seeing. And she said yes, with the full weight of a woman who has measured what she is saying and means every syllable of it. He put the ring on her hand, and it was a plain ring, silver, not elaborate, and it was exactly right. Ethan was there. He sat in the back, and he did not stay long after, but he came to Amelia before he left, and he shook her hand and said, "He's better with you." And she looked at him and said, "He was already good." And Ethan held her eyes for a moment and nodded once in the way men nod when they've been told something accurate and have the decency to accept it. That evening, They sat on the 2 chairs outside the cabin, the same chairs where she had listened to Ethan apologize, and the sky was doing the thing Arizona skies do in the early evening, going through every color. It knows extravagant and unapologetic about it, and Copper was quiet in the corral, and Tom and Denny had made themselves diplomatically scarce, and Gideon took her hand the way he had in the wagon on the road home, both of his around one of hers. "Tell me something," she said. "What do you want to know?" "Anything," she said. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He was quiet for a moment. She let it be quiet. She had learned that his silences were not empty and did not need filling. "When I built this cabin," he said slowly, "the first year I used to come out in the morning before the hands were up, and I'd stand in the yard, and I don't know how to say this without sounding like a fool." "You won't sound like a fool," she said. "I used to stand there, and I'd imagine what it would sound like," he said, "if there was someone here, if there were voices. Not any particular voice. Just the sound of a place that had people in it who wanted to be there." He paused. "I never told anyone that because there was no one to tell it to." She held his hand and looked at the sky and thought about a man standing in an empty yard in the early morning listening for a sound that hadn't come yet. She thought about a woman in Ohio reading and rereading a letter with the paper worn soft at the folds, trying to hear a future in it. "I'm here now," she said. "Yes," he said. His hand tightened around hers. "You are." They sat there until the sky ran out of colors, and the stars came in more stars than any Ohio night had ever offered, and the ranch was quiet around them, with the full inhabited quiet of a place that has people in it who want to be there. She could hear Denny saying something to Tom in the bunkhouse, and Tom's short response, and Copper shifting once and settling, and somewhere out on the night range, a coyote making its thin remote announcement to the dark. Amelia Harris had come to Arizona territory with $23 and a bundle of letters and a limp and a grandmother's voice in her head saying, "You don't choose home. Home chooses you, and you feel it in the soles of your feet before you feel it anywhere else." She felt it. She had been feeling it for weeks. She felt it now, all the way through the soles of her feet and up through her chest, and into the hand that was held in both of his, solid and warm and absolutely certain. She had crossed half a country on someone else's word and been turned away at the door, and she had walked 3 miles in the desert heat and pushed through a gate hanging on one hinge, and she had sat down beside a sick man's cot, and she had done what needed doing. She had not asked to be saved. She had not waited for rescue. She had done the work, and she had held her ground, and she had let herself slowly on her own terms be loved. And the man beside her, who had spent 14 years building something alone on hard ground and listening in the early morning for a sound that hadn't come yet, had found in her exactly the person he had been building it for, not knowing her, not expecting her, not even hoping after a while that she would come. She had come. She was here. And Amelia Wilder, who had once walked away from a train platform with nothing but what she carried in herself, had found that what she carried was more than enough, and that the life she had built with her own 2 hands on this land beside this man was the truest and most permanent thing she had ever owned.